The leather-bound folder was hidden inside, a wall safe that hadn't been opened since 1973, in the abandoned wing of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa building in Addis Ababa. When President Ibrahim Trudeau's investigative team finally cracked the safe at 2:15 a.m. on a humid Thursday morning, they found something that would shake the foundations of everything the world believed about African economic development. Inside was a detailed schedule typed on an old IBM typewriter listing dates, countries, and methods for 19 economic crises that would be deliberately triggered across Africa between 1975 and 2030. Next to each crisis was a checklist of objectives: currency devaluation targets, debt accumulation goals, asset transfer quarters, and most chillingly expected government capitulation time frame. The document was titled Operation Economic Adjustment Control Destabilization for Optimal Resource Extraction. Burkina Faso's crisis was scheduled for 2024, just 8 months away, and the preparatory phase had already begun. The discovery came after months of investigation triggered by an anonymous USB drive left at the presidential palace containing fragments of UN internal communications that seemed impossible to believe. The messages discussed triggering mechanisms and crisis implementation teams as casually as one might discuss quarterly sales targets. One email from a senior UN economic advisor read, "Ghana's economy is proving too resilient. Recommend accelerating Phase 3 to ensure compliance by Q3. Another stated, Nigeria's foreign reserves approaching dangerous levels of independence. Initiate currency attack protocol within 30 days. These weren't the communications of a humanitarian organization, but of an entity systematically destroying economies for purposes that would only become clear as the investigation deepened. The safe hadn't been discovered by accident. Dr. Aminata, Khan Abakanabi economist who had worked at the UN for 15 years before returning home, had noticed patterns in African economic crisis that defied conventional explanation. Why did currency collapses often occur just when countries were about to achieve economic independence? Why did debt crisis mysteriously emerge immediately after major resource discoveries? Why did stable economies suddenly experience inflation spirals that followed nearly identical patterns? Her research, dismissed as conspiracy theory by mainstream economists, had caught Traoré's attention when she demonstrated that every major African economic crisis since 1975 had been preceded by specific UN technical assistance missions. The schedule found in the safe was more than just dates and targets. It included detailed methodologies for each type of crisis. The currency collapse protocol described how to use international forex markets to attack a nation's currency through coordinated selling. The debt spiral mechanism outlined how to manipulate interest rates and loan conditions to make repayment mathematically impossible. The inflation trigger system explained how to create artificial scarcity in essential goods to drive prices beyond population tolerance. Each method had been tested, refined, and perfected over decades, turning economic destruction into a precise science. The 19 crises listed had all occurred exactly as scheduled. Zimbabwe's hyperinflation of 2008 was listed as Project Reset with a target of currency abandonment within 18 months. It had taken 16 months. The West African CFA franc devaluation of 1994 appeared as Operation Compliance with an objective of 50% purchasing power reduction overnight. It had achieved 49.8%. Nigeria's banking crisis of 2009 was documented as Project Consolidation aimed at foreign acquisition of 60% of banking assets. The final figure was 61.3%. The precision with which planned crisis matched actual events eliminated any possibility of coincidence. The investigation team led by Colonel Marcus Sawadogo discovered that the safe contained more than just the master schedule. There were detailed files on each crisis, including post-action reports analyzing what had worked and what could be improved. The report on Kenya's 1993 economic crisis noted population resistance higher than anticipated, recommend increased preliminary psychological operations for future implementations. The analysis of Zambia's debt crisis observed government capitulated earlier than expected. Consider reducing initial pressure to avoid suspicion in future operations. These weren't humanitarian assessments, but military-style after-action reviews of economic warfare operations. The psychological manipulation component was particularly sophisticated. Before each crisis, UN agencies would release reports predicting economic trouble, creating self-fulfilling prophecies as investors fled and citizens panicked. During crisis, UN officials would appear as saviors, offering solutions that actually deepened dependence. After crisis, UN reports would blame local corruption and mismanagement, never mentioning their own role in creating the conditions they condemned. The gas sighting was so complete that victims blamed themselves for disasters deliberately inflicted upon them. The financial mechanisms used to trigger crisis were hidden within legitimate-seeming operations. UN pension funds would suddenly divest from a country's bonds, triggering capital flight. UN procurement contracts would be mysteriously canceled, destroying export revenues. Chain development banks would simultaneously call in loans, creating impossible repayment demands. Each action alone might seem like unfortunate timing. Together, they constituted coordinated economic attack. The sophistication suggested not just planning, but decades of refinement through repeated application. The human cost documentation in the files was kept with actuarial precision. Each crisis had projections for unemployment increases, poverty expansion, mortality rises, and immigration flows. Ghana's induced crisis was expected to create 3 million newly impoverished citizens. The actual figure was 4 million. Segal's manufactured recession was projected to cause 15,000 excess deaths from reduced healthcare access. The real number was 14,750. The documents treated human suffering as data points in economic engineering exercises, calculating misery with the same detachment as calculating interest rates. The revelation that Burkina Faso's crisis was imminent sent shockwaves through Traoré's administration. The preparatory indicators were already visible. Unusual activity in currency markets, sudden changes in international lending attitudes, unexplained pessimism in UN economic reports. The schedule indicated the crisis would begin with a coordinated attack on the CFA, followed by manufactured inflation, in food prices culminating in a debt crisis that would force the government to accept structural adjustments that would transfer control of key economic sectors to foreign interests. The methods for the planned Burkina Faso crisis were particularly cruel. The country's recent gold discoveries were to be used against it, with international gold prices manipulated downward just as the country increased production, destroying government revenues. Agricultural exports would face sudden safety concerns in European markets, blocking crucial foreign exchange. International credit ratings would be mysteriously downgraded based on revised methodologies that only applied to African nations. The combined assault would create economic chaos within months. The discovery triggered immediate defensive measures. Traoré ordered the creation of emergency foreign exchange reserves held outside the traditional banking system. Food stockpiles were secretly accumulated to prevent manufactured scarcity. Alternative trading partnerships were rapidly negotiated with countries outside UN influence. Most importantly, the evidence was documented and prepared for release, though the timing had to be perfect to prevent the UN from adapting their methods. The investigation into how such a document could exist led to even more disturbing discoveries. The UN Economic Commission for Africa, ostensibly created to promote African development, had been designed from inception as an economic warfare unit. Its founding documents, classified at levels that supposedly didn't exist, described its true mission: to maintain economic conditions conducive to continued resource extraction while preventing the emergence of economically independent African states. The humanitarian facade was just that marker, a mask hiding an institution dedicated to perpetual impoverishment. The personnel files found in the safe revealed that key positions in the commission had always been held by individuals trained in economic warfare. Their resumes showed patterns: advanced degrees from specific universities, internships at particular banks, training programs at institutions that didn't officially exist. They weren't development economists, but economic soldiers deployed to Africa with missions of destruction disguised as assistants. Many had served in multiple African countries, leaving economic devastation in their wake while being promoted for their development success. The funding streams traced back to sources that should have been impossible. Major international banks were paying the UN to trigger crises that they could profit from through currency speculation and distressed asset acquisition. Multinational corporations were funding operations that would lower labor costs and reduce regulatory capacity. Even some governments were contributing to crisis creation in other countries to eliminate economic competition. The UN wasn't just creating crisis, it was selling them as a service to the highest bidder. The communication networks used to coordinate crisis implementation were hidden within normal UN operations. Economic reports contained coded messages in their statistical appendices. Development conferences included closed sessions where crisis timing was coordinated. Technical assistance visits were actually reconnaissance missions gathering intelligence for economic attacks. The entire UN development apparatus in Africa was revealed as a front for economic warfare operations. The technology employed had evolved dramatically over the decades. Early crises were triggered through manual market manipulations and coordinated policy pressures. Modern crises used algorithmic trading systems, artificial intelligence prediction models, and automated attack protocols that could destroy an economy in hours rather than months. The Burkina Faso crisis was to be the first fully automated economic destruction, run entirely by AI systems that could adapt faster than any human government could respond. The resistance network that had been fighting these operations deserved recognition. African economists who had noticed patterns and spoken out had been systematically discredited, their careers destroyed by coordinated campaigns. Some had died in suspicious accidents after getting too close to the truth. Others had been bought off or blackmailed into silence. But a few had persevered, secretly documenting evidence and waiting for someone in power brave enough to act on it. Connor had been part of this network, risking everything to gather proof of what everyone suspected, but no one could prove. The international law implications were staggering. Deliberately triggering economic crisis constituted a crime against humanity. But no legal framework existed to prosecute economic warfare. The UN's immunity from prosecution made traditional legal approaches impossible. The evidence would need to be released publicly, creating political pressure that exceeded legal protections. But the UN's control over international media meant that simply releasing evidence might not be enough. The story could be suppressed or discredited before gaining traction. The decision to prevent Burkina Faso's scheduled crisis while gathering more evidence required delicate balance. Too much preparation would alert the UN that their plans were known. Too little would leave the country vulnerable when the attack came. Traoré had to appear unaware while secretly fortifying every economic vulnerability. It was economic warfare defense conducted in complete secrecy with the fate of millions hanging in the balance. The deeper investigation revealed that the 19 African crises were part of a larger global program. Similar schedules existed for Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Eastern Europe. The UN had been managing global economic development through controlled destruction, keeping entire regions perpetually developing, but never developed. Africa was just one theater in a worldwide economic war that had been raging invisibly for decades. The philosophical implications challenged fundamental assumptions about international development. If crises were manufactured rather than natural, if poverty was enforced rather than endemic, if underdevelopment was maintained rather than accidental, then everything taught about economics was wrong. The entire field of development economics was revealed as either complicit fraud or naive ignorance. Decades of academic research had studied symptoms while ignoring or covering up causes. The evidence of specific crisis implementations was damning. The 1997 Asian financial crisis appeared in UN documents as a test run for techniques later refined in Africa. The 2008 global financial crisis had been allowed to spread to Africa despite UN ability to prevent it, because it created opportunities for asset acquisition. The COVID-19 economic impacts had been deliberately amplified in African countries through UN policy recommendations that worsened rather than mitigated damage. Every crisis had been either created or exploited for the same purpose, preventing economic independence. The role of international financial institutions became clearer as investigation progressed. The World Bank and IMF weren't separate from the UN's economic warfare, but integral parts of it. World Bank loans were designed to fail, creating debt that justified intervention. IMF structural adjustments were actually economic surrender terms, transferring sovereignty from governments to international capital. The entire Bretton Woods system had been perverted from its stated purpose of preventing economic catastrophe to creating it on demand. The discovery of training materials for crisis implementation was particularly disturbing. There were manuals on optimal crisis timing for maximum psychological impact, creating credible economic panic, and managing post-crisis narrative control. New UN economists were trained in crisis creation the way military officers were trained in combat tactics. They ran simulations where they practiced destroying fictional economies, competing for who could cause capitulation fastest with lowest implementation cost. The training materials read like terrorism handbooks, but for economic rather than physical destruction. The biological weapon parallel was explicitly acknowledged in internal documents. One memo stated, "Economic crises are superior to biological weapons because they create similar mortality and disruption while appearing natural and generating profitable reconstruction opportunities." Another observed, "A well-designed economic crisis can reduce population more effectively than conventional warfare while maintaining infrastructure for future exploitation." The documents revealed consciousness of committing mass murder through economic needs. The sexual exploitation that accompanied economic crisis was also documented. Plans included provisions for increased availability of human resources for service sectors, the euphemism for forcing women into prostitution through economic desperation. Crisis designs calculated expected increases in human trafficking, child labor, and sexual exploitation as positive outcomes that would reduce labor costs and create new profit centers. The economic warfare wasn't just destroying economies, but deliberately creating conditions for human exploitation. The environmental destruction enabled by economic crisis was intentional. Weakened governments couldn't enforce environmental regulations. Desperate populations would accept any ecological damage for economic survival. Natural resources could be extracted at minimal cost when countries were economically collapsed. Several crises had been timed to coincide with the discovery of natural resources, ensuring that extraction rights could be obtained cheaply from desperate governments. The cultural destruction was equally deliberate. Economic crisis forced educated populations to immigrate, creating brain drain. Traditional knowledge was lost as communities scattered for economic survival. Languages died as speakers dispersed. Cultural practices ended when practitioners couldn't afford to continue them. The UN documents explicitly discussed cultural simplification through economic pressure as a desired outcome that would reduce resistance to homogenization. The health system collapses induced by economic crisis were precisely calculated. Each crisis included projections for increased disease prevalence, reduced life expectancy, and elevated infant mortality. These weren't unfortunate side effects, but intended outcomes that would reduce population pressure and create dependence on international health assistance. The documents discussed optimal mortality increases with the same clinical detachment as discussing interest rate adjustments. The food security impacts were weaponized. Prices were designed to destroy local food production, forcing dependence on imports. Seed systems were disrupted so farmers couldn't plant. Storage facilities were made uneconomical so harvest rotted. Distribution networks were collapsed so food couldn't reach populations. Starvation was engineered as precisely as currency collapses with caloric deficits, calculated to create desperation without triggering humanitarian intervention that might relieve pressure. The educational system destruction was thorough. Economic crisis forced school closures, teacher immigration, and student dropouts. A generation missing education would be unable to resist future exploitation. The documents celebrated educational regression as ensuring reduced technical capacity for economic independence. They were deliberately creating ignorance that would persist for generations. The discovery of contingency plans revealed the UN's preparation for exposure. If their crisis schedule was discovered, they had prepared Operation Gaslight, a massive disinformation campaign that would portray any evidence as conspiracy theory. They had pre-written debunking articles, prepared expert witnesses who would deny everything, and created false evidence that would discredit real evidence. They had even prepared a backup plan where they would claim the crisis schedule was actually a prediction model that had unfortunately been accurate. The personal files on African leaders revealed detailed psychological profiles and manipulation strategies. Each leader's vulnerabilities had been cataloged: who could be bribed, who could be blackmailed, who could be seduced by promises of international recognition. The files included crisis response predictions analyzing how each leader would react to economic pressure and what specific pressures would cause capitulation. Chore's own file was particularly interesting, noting his unusual resistance to conventional pressure points and recommending enhanced crisis intensity for Burkina Faso. The algorithmic trading systems prepared for the Burkina Faso crisis were masterpieces of economic destruction. They could analyze millions of data points per second, identifying economic vulnerabilities and exploiting them faster than human traders could react. The systems were designed to create cascade failures, where small initial attacks would trigger automated responses that amplify damage exponentially. A $1 million attack could create billion-dollar damages through algorithmic amplification. The social media manipulation plans for the crisis were comprehensive. Thousands of bot accounts were ready to spread economic panic. Influencers had been identified for bribing to promote crisis narratives. Memes had been created to make economic collapse seem funny rather than tragic. The psychological operation was designed to create panic that would become self-fulfilling prophecy, turning fear into reality through mass behavior manipulation. The cryptocurrency component added new dimensions to economic warfare. Digital currencies had been created specifically to facilitate capital flight during crisis. Blockchain systems had been designed to lock up national assets in smart contracts that could only be released under UN control. NFTs were being used to transfer ownership of real assets through untraceable transactions during crisis chaos. The digitalization of finance had created new vulnerabilities that the UN was prepared to exploit. The discovery that several African billionaires were actually UN assets was shocking. These individuals, celebrated as African success stories, were revealed to be economic warfare agents. Their wealth came from profiting from induced crisis they had advanced knowledge of. Their businesses were designed to extract value during economic collapses. They were held up as examples of African success, while actually being instruments of African destruction. Their files included instructions for maintaining cover identity while maximizing crisis exploitation. The insurance industry's role in the crisis system was exposed through seized documents. Insurance companies were notified in advance of planned crisis, allowing them to adjust policies to avoid losses while maximizing profits. They would cancel coverage just before crisis, refuse claims during crisis, and then offer predatory products after crisis. The entire insurance system in Africa was revealed as a comple to economic warfare, profiting from advanced knowledge of planned destruction. The pharmaceutical industry's participation was equally damaging. Drug companies were informed of coming crisis so they could stockpile medications that would become scarce, driving prices up exponentially. They would withdraw affordable generic drugs just before crisis, forcing dependence on expensive branded alternatives. Some had even developed medications specifically designed to treat conditions that economic crisis would create, profiting from precisely engineered suffering. The real estate manipulation during crisis followed predictable patterns. International investors would be informed of crisis timing, allowing them to withdraw before property collapses and return to buy at bottom prices. Entire neighborhoods would be economically cleansed with local owners forced to sell at losses to foreign buyers who knew recovery was coming. The documents included maps of African cities showing which areas had been targeted for ownership transfer through economic crisis. The agricultural sector manipulation was particularly cruel. Seed companies would withdraw drought-resistant varieties just before crisis, ensuring crop failures. Fertilizer prices would be manipulated upward just when farmers were most vulnerable. Equipment suppliers would demand immediate payment for previously extended credit. The agricultural collapse would force land sales to international agribusiness at fraction of real value. Food independence was systematically destroyed through coordinated economic attack. The mining sector's advanced knowledge of crisis allowed them to negotiate extraction rights at minimal cost from desperate governments. They would stockpile extracted resources before crisis, profit from price spikes during chaos, and acquire additional concessions as governments scrambled for revenue. Several major mining companies had crisis exploitation departments that did nothing but plan for profiting from UN-induced economic collapses. The telecommunications industry used crisis to acquire spectrum rights and infrastructure at distressed prices. They would withdraw services just when communication was most needed, forcing governments to accept predatory terms for restoration. The documents showed how Africa's entire communication infrastructure had been transferred to foreign control through successive crisis-induced fire sales. The discovery of the UN's crisis success metrics was revealing. They measured success not by economic recovery, but by asset transfer, sovereignty reduction, and dependency increase. A crisis was considered successful if it achieved 60% foreign ownership of key sectors, 70% debt to GDP ratio, and 80% import dependence for essential goods. These metrics had nothing to do with development and everything to do with control. The Training Academy for Crisis Implementers was discovered to be operating in Geneva. Disguised as an economic development institute, it was actually teaching economic destruction. Students learned how to identify economic vulnerabilities, design crisis triggers, manage crisis escalation, and control post-crisis narratives. Graduates were placed in key positions throughout UN agencies, international financial institutions, and African governments. The Academy had produced hundreds of economic warfare specialists over decades. The whistleblower network within the UN that had been trying to expose these operations deserved recognition. Several UN employees had risked their careers and lives to document and leak evidence. James Morrison, former UN economist, had been found dead in apparent suicide after compiling evidence of crisis manipulation. Maria Fernandez, who had worked in UN Africa operations, had disappeared after sending encrypted files to journalists. These heroes had sacrificed everything trying to expose truth that power didn't want revealed. The media suppression system that prevented exposure was sophisticated. Major news organizations had been infiltrated by UN-trained journalists who would spike stories about economic manipulation. Editors received pressure from advertisers who were beneficiaries of crisis exploitation. Alternative media that tried to cover the story faced cyber attacks and legal harassment. The information control was so complete that even clear evidence could be suppressed or discredited. The academic complicity in hiding economic warfare was extensive. Universities received UN funding conditional on promoting certain economic theories that obscured crisis manipulation. Professors who questioned orthodox explanations for African economic problems found their research defunded and careers destroyed. Economic journals rejected papers that suggested crisis might be deliberately induced. The entire academic economics establishment was revealed as either complicit or coerced into silence. The legal framework that protected crisis creators from prosecution was deliberately constructed. International law had been written to make economic warfare legal while making resistance illegal. Countries that tried to protect themselves from economic attack could be sued for violating trade agreements. Leaders who exposed economic manipulation could be prosecuted for defamation. The legal system designed to protect nations had been inverted to protect those attacking them. The technological evolution of crisis creation was accelerating. Quantum computers could now model entire economies and identify attack vectors invisible to conventional analysis. AI systems could manage multiple simultaneous crises, adjusting tactics in real time based on response. Satellite systems could monitor economic activity and identify optimal moments for attack. The next generation of crisis would be implemented by machines operating at speeds humans couldn't match. The discovery of plans for Crisis 2.0 revealed even more frightening possibilities. Future crisis would be personalized, targeting specific individuals based on their economic behavior. Blockchain technology would be used to make crisis impacts permanent and irreversible. Genetic markers would determine who suffered most during crisis. Virtual reality would be used to make economic collapse feel like personal failure rather than systemic attack. The evolution from mass to precision economic warfare was already underway. The climate change connection added another dimension. Economic crises were being synchronized with climate events to amplify damage. Countries would be economically attacked just when they needed resources for climate adaptation. The combination of economic and environmental pressure would force acceptance of conditions that neither alone could achieve. The documents discussed optimal crisis climate events synchronization with charts showing how to maximize devastation through timing. The pandemic exploitation plans were particularly relevant given recent history. The UN had prepared detailed plans for using health crises to trigger economic collapses. They would recommend lockdowns that destroyed small businesses while protecting international corporations. They would manage vaccine distribution to create economic pressure. They would use health emergency powers to implement economic changes that would be impossible under normal circumstances. CO-19 had been a test run for more targeted future pandemic economic crisis combinations. The discovery that some African governments had been complicit in their own crisis was painful but necessary. Certain officials had been informed in advance and positioned to profit from economic collapse. They had facilitated crisis implementation in exchange for personal enrichment. These traders had sold their nation's economic sovereignty for Swiss bank accounts and European residences. Their names were listed in what UN documents called the Grateful Partners Registry. The resistance strategies that had occasionally succeeded provided hope. Botswana had somehow avoided its scheduled 2003 crisis through economic policies that inadvertently disrupted UN plans. Rwanda had recovered from its induced crisis faster than planned through unconventional approaches that weren't in UN models. These successes showed that economic warfare could be defeated, though usually by accident rather than design. The psychological impact on populations subjected to repeated crisis was documented in disturbing detail. Learned helplessness, where people stopped trying to improve their situation because experience taught that progress would be destroyed. Intergenerational trauma, where crisis expectations were transmitted from parents to children. Economic PTSD, where any sign of prosperity triggered panic about impending collapse. The psychological warfare was creating populations mentally incapable of economic development. The children's futures being stolen through economic crisis were calculated precisely. Each crisis reduced expected lifetime earnings by specific percentages. Educational disruption lowered career potential by predictable amounts. Nutritional deficits during crisis created cognitive impairments that limited future capability. The UN documents included actual tables showing how crisis exposure in childhood translated to lifetime economic limitation. They were systematically destroying human potential with mathematical precision. The gender-specific impacts of crisis were intentionally designed. Women were forced into informal economies where they could be more easily exploited. Girls were pulled from school at higher rates, ensuring educational regression. Female-headed households were made more vulnerable to create desperation that could be exploited. The documents discussed optimal gender differential impacts that would create social disruption while maintaining enough stability for continued resource extraction. The elderly was specifically targeted during crisis. Pension systems were designed to fail, forcing elderly dependence on younger generations who were themselves struggling. Traditional knowledge held by elders was lost as communities scattered for economic survival. The documents celebrated accelerated generational transition as removing resistance to modernization. They were literally calculating how to economically eliminate the old to more easily control the young. The disability creation through economic crisis was documented. Reduced healthcare access created preventable disabilities. Nutritional deficits caused developmental disabilities. Stress-induced mental health crisis created psychological disabilities. The UN documents projected disability increases as positive outcomes that would create dependence and reduce resistance capacity. They were manufacturing human suffering as a control mechanism. The religious exploitation during crisis followed patterns. Economic desperation made populations more susceptible to religious manipulation. Prosperity, gospel churches that promised wealth while extracting resources flourished. Traditional religious practices that promoted community solidarity were disrupted. The documents discussed using spiritual redirection during economic stress to channel resistance into ineffective prayer rather than action. The criminal networks that flourished during crisis were intentionally enabled. Economic collapse created conditions where crime became survival. Criminal organizations were allowed to establish themselves during crisis chaos. These networks then became instruments for continued exploitation after crisis, managing illegal resource extraction and human trafficking. The documents referred to useful disorder that crisis created. The discovery of the final crisis plan was most terrifying. After decades of periodic crisis, an ultimate synchronized crisis was planned that would permanently collapse African economic independence. Every country would be hit simultaneously with perfectly tailored attacks. Recovery would be impossible because mutual assistance would be eliminated. The continent would be forced to accept complete economic reorganization under UN control. The date was set for 2030, corresponding with sustainable development goals that would provide cover for total economic takeover. The evidence Traoré's team had uncovered painted a picture of systematic economic genocide conducted over decades. Millions had died from crisis-induced poverty. Billions had been impoverished through manufactured economic collapse. Trillions in wealth had been transferred from African to foreign hands. The UN, created supposedly to prevent humanitarian catastrophe, had been creating it on industrial scale while posing as savior. The decision on how to respond required careful consideration. Simply releasing the evidence might trigger immediate implementation of all remaining scheduled crises, but holding it secret would allow continued preparation for Burkina Faso's crisis and the final crisis. Traoré needed to build a coalition of African leaders who could coordinate response. He needed to prepare economic defenses that could withstand accelerated attack. He needed to document everything so thoroughly that denial would be impossible. The preparation for revelation began immediately. Copies of all evidence were distributed to secure locations worldwide. Dead man switches were established that would automatically release everything if key people disappeared. Alternative economic systems were quietly established that could function outside UN control. Food and fuel reserves were accumulated. Foreign exchange was moved to institutions beyond UN reach. The country began economic war preparations while maintaining appearance of normal operations. The coalition building required delicate diplomacy. Many African leaders were compromised, either complicit or blackmailed. Others were skeptical, unable to believe the UN could be so systematically evil. Still others were terrified, knowing that exposure might trigger immediate economic attack. Traoré had to convince, protect, and coordinate with leaders across the continent while maintaining absolute secrecy. A single leak could trigger catastrophic preemptive strikes. The international allies were few but crucial. Some European politicians who had discovered fragments of the crisis system provided support. Latin American leaders who had experienced similar manipulation offered advice. Asian economists who had traced their own crisis to UN manipulation shared defensive strategies. A global network of resistance to economic warfare began forming, though it remained fragile and hidden. The preparation of populations for potential crisis required psychological fortification without creating panic. Communities were encouraged to strengthen local economic networks that could survive national collapse. Traditional exchange systems that didn't depend on official currency were revived. Food production and storage at household level were promoted. The population was being prepared for economic war without being told war was coming. The counterintelligence operations to prevent UN discovery of preparations were complex. False economic data was released, showing vulnerabilities that didn't exist while hiding actual strengths. UN spies within government were fed disinformation about economic planning. Electronic communications were filled with false discussions, while real planning happened through traditional messengers. The country had to appear economically naive while conducting sophisticated defensive preparations. The technological defenses developed included algorithmic systems that could detect and counter economic attacks in real time, cryptocurrency reserves that couldn't be frozen by traditional banking, satellite communications that bypassed UN-controlled networks. Even quantum computing resources were secretly acquired to match UN crisis implementation capabilities. The technological arms race for economic warfare was accelerating. The D-Day for Burkina Faso scheduled crisis approached with mounting tension. UN economic missions increased their visits, conducting what they called technical assessments, but were actually final reconnaissance. International media began running stories about Burkina Faso's economic vulnerabilities. Currency speculators started testing defensive positions. The attack was imminent, but this time the target was prepared. The first probe came exactly as scheduled. Coordinated selling of CFA francs that should have triggered panic. But Traoré's hidden reserves absorbed the attack without visible strain. The second wave targeted food supplies, but strategic stockpiles prevented price spikes. The third assault on banking systems met prepared firewalls that contained damage. Each attack was met with invisible defense that made it seem to fail naturally rather than being actively countered. The UN's confusion at their failed crisis was evident in intercepted communications. Burkina resistance anomalous recommend diagnostic assessment crisis. Parameters not achieving projected. Impacts suspect external interference escalation to level 5. Protocols authorized they couldn't understand why their perfect plan was failing, not realizing it had been. Perfectly countered the decision to reveal the evidence came when the UN began preparing. Unprecedented escalation they were about to implement. biological weapons disguised as disease, outbreaks, weather modification to destroy agriculture, and even tactical nuclear accidents to create economic panic. The defensive options were exhausted. It was time to go offensive with truth. The revelation was coordinated across multiple platforms simultaneously. At exactly noon GMT, evidence packages were released to every major media outlet, uploaded to thousands of websites, broadcast on satellite channels, and distributed through encrypted networks. The UN crisis schedule, the implementation documents, the death calculations, the asset transfer plans. The initial response was exactly as UN documents had predicted. Denial claims of forgery, attempts to discredit sources, but the evidence was too comprehensive, too detailed, too consistent with observed reality. Economic historians began matching scheduled crisis with actual events. Survivors of economic collapses recognized the patterns they had lived through. The truth was undeniable to anyone willing to see it. The UN's Operation Gaslight response was implemented immediately. Fact-checkers declared the evidence mostly false without examining it. Expert witnesses appeared on news programs explaining why economic crises were natural and unavoidable. Alternative explanations were offered that acknowledged some planning, but reframed it as benevolent prediction rather than malevolent creation. The information war was as intense as any economic war, but Trout had anticipated this response and prepared counter-narratives. Survivors of previous crises testified about their experiences. Economists who had been silenced finally spoke freely. Whistleblowers came forward with additional evidence. The human faces of crisis victims made abstract economic warfare real and undeniable. The UN's narrative control began fracturing under weight of testimony. The international response was mixed but significant. Some European countries called for immediate UN investigation. The African Union demanded suspension of all UN economic programs. China and Russia, seeing opportunity to weaken Western-dominated institutions, supported calls for reform. The United States and major European powers whose corporations had benefited from crisis exploitation sought to minimize and contain scandal. The legal battles began immediately. The UN claimed immunity from prosecution. Affected nations demanded reparations for induced crisis. International courts were petitioned to rule on whether economic warfare constituted crimes against humanity. The legal system that had protected crisis creators was being challenged by crisis victims demanding justice. The economic aftermath of revelation was itself a crisis. Markets panicked at the exposure of systematic manipulation. Currencies fluctuated wildly as traders tried to understand which values were real and which were manufactured. International development aid collapsed as trust evaporated. The exposure of economic warfare triggered the economic chaos it had been designed to create. But this crisis was different because its causes were known. Countries could coordinate defense because they understood attack. Populations could resist manipulation because they recognized techniques. The crisis created by exposure was painful, but clarify like surgery removing cancer. The healing could begin because the disease was finally diagnosed. The reconstruction of economic theory began immediately. Everything assumed about development, growth, and crisis had to be reconsidered. New models that incorporated deliberate sabotage as a variable were developed. Economic defense became as important as economic development. The entire field of economics had to be rebuilt on foundation of truth rather than deception. The cultural impact was profound. The revelation that poverty was manufactured rather than natural transformed psychology of entire populations. Fatalism was replaced by anger. Acceptance was replaced by resistance. The mental chains of assumed inferiority were broken by evidence of deliberate suppression. The psychological liberation was as important as economic liberation. The children who learned about the UN crisis schedule would grow up with different assumptions. They would know that economic problems had solutions, that crises weren't inevitable, that development was possible when not sabotaged. The generational trauma of repeated crisis could begin healing with understanding that trauma had been deliberately inflicted rather than naturally occurring. The new economic architectures that emerged were designed for resilience against warfare. Regional currencies that couldn't be externally attacked. Food systems that couldn't be disrupted. Energy networks that couldn't be controlled. The defensive infrastructure that had been built for one crisis became foundation for economic independence. The reconciliation process was complex. Many who had participated in crisis implementation claimed they didn't know the full scope. Others argued they were following orders. Some insisted they believed they were helping. The line between victim and perpetrator was often blurred, with many playing both roles. Truth commissions were established to document experiences and assign responsibility. The reparations negotiations were unprecedented. How do you compensate for decades of deliberately induced poverty? How do you calculate damages for stolen futures? How do you restore lives lost to manufactured crisis? The numbers were astronomical, potentially hundreds of trillions in damages. But more than money, what was demanded was systematic change to prevent future economic warfare. The reform proposals ranged from moderate to revolutionary. Some called for UN economic functions to be eliminated. Others demanded complete restructuring with African leadership. Still others proposed alternative international systems that bypassed UN entirely. The consensus was that status quo was unacceptable, but agreement on replacement remained elusive. The ongoing investigation continued, revealing connections. Every major economic crisis globally showed signs of deliberate induction. The 2008 financial crisis had fingerprints of intentional triggering. The 1997 Asian crisis had been test run for techniques later used in Africa. Even the Great Depression showed evidence of conscious creation rather than accidental occurrence. The rabbit hole of economic manipulation went deeper than anyone imagined. The personal impact on Traoré was significant. He had prevented his country's scheduled crisis and exposed global economic warfare system. But the knowledge of how much suffering could have been prevented if truth had been revealed earlier weighed heavily. Every African who had died from poverty induced by manufactured crisis was a preventable death. Every child whose potential was destroyed by economic warfare was a stolen future. The victory in exposing the system was tempered by grief for decades of unnecessary suffering that revelation earlier might have prevented. The technological arms race in economic warfare accelerated after exposure. The UN and its allies developed new crisis mechanisms that were harder to detect and counter. African nations invested in defensive technologies that could identify and resist economic attacks. The battlefield had shifted from hidden to visible, but the war continued with both sides now aware they were fighting. The next generation of economic warfare would be fought with quantum computers, artificial intelligence, and technologies that hadn't been invented yet. The educational revolution that followed changed how economics was taught globally. Universities had to acknowledge that their theories had been either wrong or deliberately misleading. New curricula incorporated economic warfare as a real phenomenon that must be understood and defended against. Students learned to identify crisis triggers, recognize manipulation patterns, and develop defensive strategies. The generation educated after revelation would be immunized against economic warfare through knowledge. The media transformation was equally dramatic. News organizations that had been complicit in hiding economic warfare faced bankruptcy as audiences abandoned them for alternative sources that had reported truth. New media ecosystems emerged that specialized in economic warfare analysis. Every economic event was now scrutinized for signs of deliberate manipulation. The information environment that had enabled hidden warfare became surveillance system for detecting it. The religious institutions grappled with theological implications of manufactured suffering. If poverty was deliberately created rather than divinely ordained, what did that mean for prosperity gospel? If economic crisis were human evil rather than divine testing, how should faith communities respond? The revelation that much suffering attributed to God was actually caused by international organizations triggered crisis of faith that required fundamental theological reconsideration. The psychological treatment programs for economic warfare trauma became a new medical specialty. Therapists developed techniques for treating manufactured poverty, PTSD-induced crisis anxiety, and systematic exploitation depression. The mental health impacts of discovering that suffering had been deliberate rather than natural required entirely new therapeutic approaches. Healing from economic warfare trauma would take generations. The cultural renaissance that emerged from understanding that suppression had been deliberate was explosive. Art that had been constrained by manufactured poverty flourished with new resources and freedom. Literature that documented economic warfare experiences became a new genre. Music that expressed rage at deliberate impoverishment and joy at liberation created new sounds. The cultural explosion from removed constraints exceeded anything seen in human history. The technological innovations developed by Africans once economic warfare pressure was removed astonished the world. Within 5 years of revelation, African scientists had developed revolutionary energy systems, medical treatments, and agricultural techniques. The innovative capacity that had been deliberately suppressed erupted with creativity that advanced human knowledge in unprecedented ways. The world discovered what African genius could achieve when not systematically sabotaged. The diplomatic revolution saw African nations achieving unprecedented unity. The common experience of economic warfare created solidarity that transcended traditional divisions. The African Union evolved from ceremonial organization to effective defensive alliance. African nations began negotiating as a bloc, their collective economic power now impossible to attack individually. The unity that economic warfare had tried to prevent emerged stronger from shared understanding of common enemy. The financial innovations created to resist economic warfare became models globally. Blockchain currencies that couldn't be manipulated. Quantum encrypted banking that couldn't be hacked. AI-managed reserves that couldn't be attacked. African financial technology leapfrogged traditional systems. The continent that had been portrayed as financially backward became leader in financial innovation, teaching the world how to create manipulation-resistant economic systems. The agricultural transformation freed from economic warfare was remarkable. Within 3 years, Africa achieved food self-sufficiency that had been deliberately prevented for decades. Advanced techniques that had been suppressed were implemented. Productivity soared when farmers weren't being systematically sabotaged. The continent that had been kept hungry despite abundant agricultural potential became food exporter feeding populations globally. The industrial development that economic warfare had prevented erupted across the continent. Factories that processed raw materials rather than exporting them were built. Technology companies that created rather than consumed innovation were established. Manufacturing capacity that had been deliberately destroyed was rebuilt stronger. The Industrial Revolution that had been delayed by century through economic warfare happened in a decade. The space program that emerged shocked everyone who believed Africans couldn't achieve technological excellence within 7 years of revelation. African nations had launched satellites, established space agencies, and were planning lunar missions. The technological capability that had been hidden by manufactured poverty was revealed as equal to any on Earth. The stars that had seemed unreachable during economic warfare became achievable goals. The environmental restoration possible without economic warfare, pressure exceeded expectations. Resources that had been extracted under crisis to rest were now managed sustainably. Ecosystems that had been destroyed by desperate populations were rehabilitated. The environmental destruction that economic warfare had necessitated was reversed with remarkable speed when deliberate pressure was removed. The health advances achieved without economic warfare constraints saved millions of lives. Diseases that had persisted because healthcare systems were deliberately collapsed were eliminated. Medical research that had been impossible during manufactured crisis produced breakthrough treatments. Life expectancy increased by decades within a generation. The health catastrophe that economic warfare had created was reversed with stunning rapidity. The educational achievements of children not subjected to crisis disrupted schooling amazed educators globally. Literacy rates approached 100% within a decade. University graduation rates exceeded European levels. Advanced degrees that had seemed impossible for African institutions were achieved routinely. The educational suppression that economic warfare had enforced was replaced by intellectual flourishing that advanced human knowledge. The gender equality achieved without economic warfare. Pressure transformed societies. Women who weren't forced into survival mode by manufactured crisis could pursue education and careers. Girls who weren't pulled from school by economic desperation achieved unprecedented success. The gender regression that economic warfare had created was reversed, with African women achieving leadership positions globally. The elderly who survived economic warfare became living libraries of resistance knowledge. Their experiences of surviving deliberate crisis were documented for future generations. Their traditional knowledge that economic warfare had tried to eliminate was preserved and transmitted. They became honored teachers rather than economic burdens. Their wisdom finally valued rather than suppressed. The disability community that economic warfare had expanded through deliberate deprivation became advocates for inclusive development. Their experiences of manufactured suffering informed policies ensuring no one would be deliberately disabled through economic manipulation. Again, the disabilities that economic warfare had created became rallying points for ensuring economic justice. The criminal networks that economic warfare had created to manage chaos were systematically dismantled without crisis conditions justifying their existence. Organized crime lost its economic foundation. The criminality that had flourished during manufactured disorder withered when stability was achieved. The crime wave that economic warfare had necessitated receded with its cessation. The international coalition against economic warfare expanded beyond Africa. Latin American nations that discovered their crisis had been manufactured joined the alliance. Asian countries tracing their economic collapses to deliberate triggers became members. Eastern European nations recognizing patterns in their transitions allied themselves. The Global South united against economic warfare with unprecedented solidarity. The northern nations that had benefited from economic warfare faced internal reckonings. Citizens discovered their prosperity had been built on deliberately induced suffering elsewhere. Protests demanded reparations for economic warfare victims. Governments that had participated faced electoral defeats. The political cost of economic warfare exposure transformed global politics. The corporate accountability for economic warfare participation became a major legal battlefield. Companies that had profited from advanced knowledge of manufactured crisis faced lawsuits. Corporations that had acquired assets during deliberate collapses were forced to return them. Businesses built on economic warfare exploitation faced bankruptcy. The corporate impunity that had enabled economic warfare ended with exposure. The religious reconciliation between faiths that economic warfare had divided began tentatively. Christians, Muslims, and traditional practitioners who had been turned against each other by manufactured scarcity began dialogue. The interfaith conflict that economic warfare had fostered to prevent unity was replaced by solidarity against common exploitation. The religious division that had been weaponed became source of united strength. The generational healing between those who had collaborated with economic warfare and those who had resisted required truth and reconciliation processes. Many collaborators had been coerced or deceived. Some resistors had survived through morally complex choices. The line between victim and perpetrator was often unclear. The healing required acknowledging that economic warfare had corrupted everyone it touched. The archives of economic warfare evidence became public resources for preventing future attacks. Every document was digitized and made searchable. Pattern recognition algorithms identified warning signs of economic manipulation. The knowledge that had enabled economic warfare became immunization against it. The secrets that had protected economic warfare were exposed to prevent repetition. The memorials to economic warfare victims were established globally. Names of those who died from manufactured poverty were inscribed. Communities destroyed by deliberate crisis were remembered. The suffering that economic warfare had caused was memorialized to ensure it would never be forgotten or repeated. The invisible victims became visible testimonies. The curriculum on economic warfare resistance became mandatory education. Every student learned to recognize economic attack patterns. Financial self-defense was taught alongside traditional subjects. Economic warfare awareness became as fundamental as literacy. The vulnerability that ignorance had created was replaced by educated vigilance. The technological systems for detecting economic warfare were continuously upgraded. Quantum sensors detected market manipulations. AI systems identified crisis patterns. Satellite networks monitored economic attacks. The surveillance that had enabled economic warfare was turned against it. The hunters became hunted. The legal frameworks criminalizing economic warfare were established internationally. Deliberate crisis induction became crime against humanity. Economic manipulation was classified as warfare requiring defensive response. Financial sovereignty was recognized as fundamental right. The legal vacuum that had permitted economic warfare was filled with protective law. The economic models incorporating warfare variables became standard. No economic prediction could ignore possibility of deliberate attack. Development planning required defensive components. Growth strategies included warfare resistance. The economics that had ignored economic warfare evolved to acknowledge its reality. The philosophical implications continued deepening. If economic reality could be manufactured, what was real? If poverty was artificial, what was natural? If development could be prevented, what was possible? The revelation of economic warfare challenged fundamental assumptions about reality itself. The 5-year anniversary of Revelation was marked by Traoré addressing the United Nations General Assembly, the same body that had planned Burkina economic destruction. His speech was measured but devastating. We stand in the building where our economic deaths were planned with bureaucratic precision. We speak to the organization that manufactured our poverty while pretending to alleviate it. We address those who calculated our suffering as acceptable costs for their prosperity. But we do not come for revenge. We come for transformation. The economic warfare you waged against us has failed. The crisis you manufactured have been exposed. The poverty you enforced has been overcome. We have survived your worst and emerged stronger. The question now is whether you will transform or be transformed. Economic warfare ends now, either by your choice or by our resistance. Choose wisely. The transformation of the UN that followed was radical, but necessary. Economic functions were completely restructured with African leadership. Crisis creation capabilities were dismantled under international supervision. Reparations programs were established to compensate economic warfare victims. The institution that had waged economic war was forcibly converted to economic peace. The ongoing vigilance required to prevent economic warfare revival was institutionalized. International monitoring systems watched for crisis patterns. Economic defense alliances maintained readiness. Research continued on new warfare methods and countermeasures. The peace achieved was armed peace maintained through strength rather than trust. The global economic system that emerged from economic warfare exposure was fundamentally different. Manipulation-resistant currencies attacked proof banking crisis-immune trade systems. The new architecture was designed for defense. The vulnerability that had enabled economic warfare was engineered out of new systems. The human development achieved without economic warfare exceeded all projections. Within a decade, African human development indices matched European levels. Within 2 decades, they exceeded them. Within 3 decades, Africa led global human development. The potential that economic warfare had suppressed was finally realized. The reflection on what economic warfare had caused humanity was sobering. Centuries of human potential destroyed. Millions of lives lost. Trillions in wealth stolen. Immeasurable suffering inflicted. The crime was too vast for complete comprehension, requiring new language to describe evil of such scope. But the reflection on what exposure and resistance had achieved was inspiring. Truth had defeated deception. Courage had overcome fear. Unity had beaten division. The human spirit had proven resilient against systematic attack. The victory wasn't just economic, but spiritual proof that evil, no matter how sophisticated, could be exposed and defeated. The children born after economic warfare exposure would inhabit a different world. They would assume economic sovereignty rather than dependence. They would expect development rather than crisis. They would demand justice rather than accept exploitation. The generational transformation was complete might from victims of economic warfare to victors over it. As the sun set on the 10th anniversary of Revelation, Trudeau stood before memorial to economic warfare victims. The names of millions who had died from manufactured poverty were inscribed on black marble, but beside it stood a monument to resistance. The names of those who had fought economic warfare, many posthumously. His final words echoed across the gathered crop. They waged economic war against us for decades. They manufactured our poverty, calculated our suffering, and profited from our pain. But we survived. We exposed. We overcame. The schedule of crisis they planned will never be implemented. The economic warfare they perfected has been defeated. To those who died from manufactured poverty, we promise never again. To those who profited from our suffering, we declare never again. To those who would attempt economic warfare in future, we warn never again. We have learned to recognize economic attack, resist economic manipulation, and defeat economic warfare. The age of economic warfare is ending. The age of economic justice has begun. The investigation files were sealed but not classified, available to any researcher willing to confront the horror of systematic economic warfare. The evidence would stand as permanent testimony to human capacity for evil and human resilience against it. The UN Schedule of 19 deliberately induced economic crisis would forever remind humanity that poverty was not natural but manufactured, that underdevelopment was not inevitable but enforced, that economic suffering was not accidental but intentional. The transformation from victim to victor, from target to defender, from manipulated to aware was complete. Africa had not just survived economic warfare, but had exposed it, defeated it, and immunized itself against future attack. The continent, portrayed as economically helpless, had become the teacher of economic defense. The people targeted for perpetual poverty had achieved unprecedented prosperity. The economic warfare that was meant to destroy had instead catalyzed transformation. The story of the UN-scheduled crisis would be told for generations, studied in schools, analyzed in universities, and remembered in communities. It would serve as warning that institutions created for good perverted for evil, that humanitarian facades could hide genocidal intent, that economic policy could be weaponized for mass murder. But it would also serve as inspiration, that truth could be discovered, evil exposed, and justice achieved even against seemingly omnipotent institutions. The 19 scheduled economic crises that were meant to destroy Africa had instead destroyed the system that created them. The revelation Traoré had triggered hadn't just prevented Burkina Faso's crisis, but had ended the age of economic warfare. The folder found in an abandoned safe had changed history. The schedule of destruction had become blueprint for liberation. And the economic warfare meant to impoverish had instead enriched through the invaluable gift of truth, awareness, and permanent vigilance against those who would manufacture suffering for profit. The legacy of the revelation continued rippling through unexpected channels. Insurance companies worldwide had to recalculate their entire risk models once they understood that many natural economic disasters had been deliberately triggered. The actuarial science that had assumed random distribution of crisis had to be completely rebuilt with manipulation as a core variable. Several major insurers collapsed when it was revealed they had been complicit in the crisis system, selling policies they knew would be triggered by planned events. The insurance industry that had profited from manufactured uncertainty was forced to restructure around genuine risk rather than orchestrated catastrophe. The discovery of secondary crisis schedules in other UN agencies revealed the true scope of the economic warfare system. The World Health Organization had health crisis schedules designed to coincide with economic attacks. UNESCO had cultural disruption plans timed to prevent social cohesion during economic manipulation. UNICEF had child welfare crisis schedules that would justify interventions during economic collapse. Every UN agency had been weaponized for economic warfare, their humanitarian missions perverted into attack vectors. The coordination required for such comprehensive assault revealed planning that had taken generations to perfect. The neurological research conducted on populations subjected to repeated economic crisis showed permanent brain changes. The constant stress of manufactured uncertainty had altered neural pathways, creating populations neurologically primed for exploitation. Children who grew up during crisis periods showed reduced activity in brain regions associated with long-term planning and increased activity in survival-focused areas. The economic warfare hadn't just stolen wealth, but had literally rewired human brains for vulnerability. The recovery would require not just economic reconstruction, but neurological rehabilitation. The quantum economic models developed to understand crisis manipulation revealed that the UN had been using principles of quantum mechanics in their attacks. They had discovered that economic systems exhibited quantum property. East superposition, where markets could exist in multiple states simultaneously. Entanglement, where distant markets affected each other instantly. And observation effects, where measuring economic variables changed their values. The crisis creators had been using quantum economic warfare while defenders were still thinking in classical economic terms. The technological gap in economic warfare capabilities was decades wide. The archaeological evidence of historical economic warfare showed this wasn't humanity's first experience with systematic economic destruction. Ancient tablets from Mesopotamia described similar patterns of deliberate crisis creation. Roman histories documented economic warfare against Carthage that followed familiar patterns. The Dutch tulip bubble showed signs of deliberate manipulation. The UN hadn't invented economic warfare, but had perfected techniques that had existed throughout human history. The revelation reframed all economic history as potentially manipulated rather than naturally occurring. The genetic research on populations subjected to prolonged economic warfare revealed epigenetic changes that were passed to children. The stress of manufactured poverty had activated genes associated with metabolic hoarding, risk aversion, and threat detection. These genetic changes were heritable, meaning children inherited biological programming for poverty. Even when economic conditions improved, the economic warfare had been altering human evolution, creating populations genetically programmed for exploitation. The biological damage would persist for generations, even after economic recovery. The discovery of the UN's project. Prometheus changed understanding of their ultimate goals. Named after the Titan who stole fire from the gods, this project aimed to concentrate all human economic capability in a small group while reducing the rest of humanity to subsistence. The economic crisis were just phase one of a multi-generational plan to create a permanent economic aristocracy ruling over deliberately impoverished masses. The 19 African crises were test runs for global implementation. The stakes hadn't just been African prosperity, but the economic freedom of all humanity. The resistance movements that had operated during the economic warfare period deserved their own recognition. The underground economists had been secretly documenting crisis patterns and developing defensive strategies. The currency defenders had been creating alternative exchange systems immune to manipulation. The archive guards had been preserving true economic history despite efforts to rewrite it. These groups had operated without communication between them, each thinking they alone saw the truth. Their collective efforts had preserved the evidence and knowledge that made exposure possible. The corporate tribunals established to prosecute economic warfare, profiteers faced unique challenges. Many corporations claimed they were just responding to market conditions, not creating them. Others argued that maximizing profit during crisis was fiduciary duty to shareholders. Still others insisted they had been coerced into participation by threats of being targeted themselves. The line between opportunistic profiteering and deliberate collaboration was often blurred. New legal frameworks had to be created to address corporate crimes that were technically legal under laws written to enable them. The educational transformation required to prevent future economic warfare extended beyond economics into all disciplines. History classes now taught about manufactured crisis alongside natural disasters. Psychology courses included study of economic trauma and manipulation. Mathematics included detection of statistical manipulation used to hide economic warfare. Even art classes studied how culture had been used to normalize economic exploitation. The curriculum revolution touched every subject, acknowledging that economic warfare had infected all aspects of human knowledge. The spiritual recovery from economic warfare required new theological frameworks. Religious communities had to reconcile belief in divine justice with evidence of systematic human evil. Some developed theologies of resistance that saw fighting economic warfare as sacred duty. Others created contemplative practices for healing from economic trauma. The spiritual damage from discovering that suffering had been manufactured rather than meaningful required entirely new approaches to faith and meaning-making. The children's literature created after the revelation helped young minds understand what had happened without being overwhelmed by horror. Stories of brave economists who fought invisible monsters that ate prosperity. Tales of communities that survived the crisis storms through solidarity. Adventures of young heroes who discovered magic documents that revealed truth. The complex reality of economic warfare was translated into narratives. Children could understand and learn from without being traumatized by the full truth. The international legal precedents established through economic warfare prosecutions revolutionized international law. Economic sovereignty became recognized as fundamental as territorial sovereignty. Economic manipulation was classified as act of war justifying self-defense. Corporate involvement in economic warfare became prosecutable regardless of where crimes occurred or where corporations were based. The legal architecture that had protected economic warfare was replaced with one that criminalized it comprehensively. As Trey reflected on the journey from discovering the crisis schedule to transforming global economic systems, he recognized that victory was never complete. The forces that had created economic warfare still existed, seeking new methods of exploitation. The price of economic freedom, like political freedom, was eternal vigilance. The systems created to prevent economic warfare would require constant updating as attack methods evolved. The war was won, but the watch was eternal. His final public statement captured this reality. We discovered their schedule of our destruction and prevented it. We exposed their system of our impoverishment and dismantled it. We survived their economic warfare and defeated it. But victory is not permanent. It must be defended daily, renewed generationally, and transmitted faithfully to those who come after us. The schedule of 19 crises will never be implemented, but new schedules are always being written. Our task is not just to celebrate victory, but to maintain vigilance. Economic warfare has been defeated, but not destroyed. It waits for complacency to return. We must never give it that opportunity. The price of prosperity, we have learned, is perpetual watchfulness against those who would manufacture our poverty.